that is that kind of decides what we're going to do, and then there's the follower part that decides to go off and do these kinds of things. He says that for a long time in human history, human beings were simply creatures of habit, and we didn't distinguish, we didn't experience ourselves as making decisions at all. When we thought for ourselves, we interpreted those thoughts as as coming from the voices of God. And so even as late as, say, 3 or 2000 BC, what most people just kind of went on their lives as kind of automatons, not thinking about too much of anything, not deciding too much about anything. When you look at social structure in these communities, as far as we understand them, they're very hierarchical, where there's a king or somebody like that who speaks the commands of God, and everybody else just kind of follows. What James argued was that around 1400 BC, as humans began to gather into large urban civilizations with a lot of division of labor and contact between one city-state and another, they began to experience people disagreeing with each other. Okay, it's at this point that in ancient writings we begin to get the idea that the gods are just kind of leaving and not participating in human affairs anymore. And people begin to not just think for themselves, because they were always doing that, but they began to experience themselves as thinking for themselves, as realizing that my thoughts aren't coming from the gods, my thoughts are my thoughts. And your thoughts aren't coming from the gods, because if they were, they'd be the same thoughts, because it's just one set of gods, okay? So that you must be thinking for yourself as well. So James's argument is about 1400 BC, as we begin to get these large urban civilizations again, people began to realize where their thoughts came from, that their thoughts were the products of their own minds. If you will, they got a theory of mind, really for the first time, and that this whole process was consolidated by about 600 BC, not just in Greece, but in lots of other places. What's interesting is that by about 600 BC in ancient Greece, you get for the first time a lot of people talking about the nature of thinking. Get a lot of people talking about the human mind and about cognition. On one of the pillars at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi is this inscription that's attributed to Solon, about 600 BC, of "Know thyself." Piece of language that just doesn't appear anywhere else before then. You get people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle laying out the laws of logical reasoning and beginning to get people to think for themselves. What's the great quote from Plato? "The unexamined life is not worth living." Okay, and even elsewhere in other civilizations, you get pretty much the same thing happening at about the same time. So, for example, around the same time, Buddha, the Buddha in India, is teaching that people's suffering is due to the way they think, and that if they would think differently, they'd suffer a lot less. And in China, Confucius is teaching that people should learn how to think and begin to think for themselves. What James argues, okay, is that what we're seeing around this time, somewhere between around 1300 BC and about 600 BC, is a major cognitive shift in the human species from people who really experienced themselves and behaved out of habit, creatures of habit, automatons, if you will, into people who thought for themselves, who decided what to do, who understood that different people had different kinds of beliefs and attempted to reconcile those. It's not the case, although James writes this way a little bit. It's 1976, after all. Nobody had thought about the theory of mind yet. Sometimes James is misinterpreted as thinking that somewhere in historical time the two hemispheres came together. All right? Somehow we got the corpus callosum or something like that. That wasn't his view, and if it was, it would have been a big mistake. But I think if James were still alive today, which unfortunately he's not, he would recognize in contemporary discussions about the acquisition of a theory of mind exactly the kind of thing that he was talking about back in the 1970s, that at some point in human history, at some point in our cultural history, we realized we had minds and that we could use to think for ourselves and decide things for ourselves in a way that we really didn't realize that before. So we can think about the origin of consciousness in phylogenetic terms, in terms of at what point in human evolution did we get consciousness, at what how far back in the evolution of species does consciousness extend. We can think about consciousness in ontogenetic terms, in terms of at what point in the lifespan of the individual does the individual come to consciousness and begin to be conscious in the way that adults experience ourselves. Or we can think about this in cultural terms, that at some point in human history we became conscious in a way that we hadn't been before. We'll finish this up on Wednesday. Thank you very much.